What if progress doesn't always disappear because it fails, but because it succeeds too completely? The story begins not with a single invention, but with a quiet pattern. It hides in footnotes of history, in laboratory reports that gathered dust, in demonstrations that worked exactly as promised and then were gently set aside. These are not tales of fraud or fantasy. They are moments when human ingenuity reached something elegant, effective, and unsettling in its completeness. Picture a small laboratory early in the 20th century. Glassware gleams under soft light. A researcher watches bacteria collapse from within, defeated not by chemicals, but by nature itself. Or imagine an engineer striking a car panel with a hammer, expecting resistance, only to see the tool bounce away as if insulted. Or a doctor standing at a bedside, astonished as a tumor recedes after the body's own defenses awaken. Each moment is real. Each is documented. And each carries the same quiet aftershock. If this works, what comes next? We like to believe history moves forward in a straight line. Problem, solution, improvement. But progress rarely behaves so politely. It collides with habit. It challenges infrastructure. It asks uncomfortable questions about what we value and what we're willing to leave behind. Sometimes the most disruptive force isn't a radical idea. It's a practical one. Across decades and disciplines, certain innovations shared a strange fate. They solved problems not incrementally but decisively. They offered abundance where scarcity had long reigned, durability where decay was expected, independence where dependency had been normalized. And in doing so, they unsettled systems built around maintenance, replacement, control, or profit. This is not a story about villains in dark rooms or grand conspiracies whispered across continents. It is quieter than that, more human. It's about momentum, incentives, and the invisible gravity of existing systems. About how institutions, medical, industrial, economic, often evolve to manage problems rather than eliminate them, and how a solution that works too well can feel less like salvation and more like a threat. Consider how many modern comforts depend on repetition. Medicines taken daily, materials replaced every decade, infrastructure repaired endlessly, energy rationed, water priced, soil supplemented, illness managed rather than cured. These patterns aren't accidental. They shape careers, markets, and expectations. When a discovery arrives that suggests a different rhythm, less frequent, less consumptive, more self-sustaining, it doesn't just offer an alternative. It asks us to rethink the entire arrangement. The people behind these breakthroughs were not crusaders. They were scientists, farmers, doctors, engineers. Curious minds following evidence where it led. Many were celebrated at first. Awards were given, papers published, demonstrations applauded. The silence came later, gradual, procedural, often polite, funding redirected, regulations tightened, attention drifted elsewhere. And yet the results remained. In archived photographs, in patient records, in test sites that refused to deteriorate, in crops that grew richer with less input, in systems that healed themselves or ran continuously or asked almost nothing in return. This series is an invitation to revisit those moments, not to romanticize them, and not to claim they were perfect or inevitable, but to sit with the questions they raise. What happens when a solution doesn't fit the world as it is? How do we decide which futures are pursued and which are quietly shelved? And what might it say about us that some of the most promising answers to human problems were not defeated by nature, but by hesitation? As we move through these stories, keep one thought close. Progress is not only about what we invent. It is also about what we choose to remember and what we allow ourselves to imagine again. It started with a virus that wasn't meant to harm us, but to save us. In the early 20th century, long before antibiotics reshaped medicine, scientists were exploring a quieter, more precise form of healing. It came from nature itself, microscopic viruses known as bacteriophages. These tiny entities didn't attack human cells. Instead, they hunted bacteria, infecting and destroying them from within. In an era when infections were often fatal, this was a revelation. In the city of Tbilisi, Georgia, researchers at the Eliava Institute developed phage therapy into a powerful medical tool. The results were extraordinary. Infections that would normally lead to amputation or death responded quickly to targeted phages. Soldiers wounded in war recovered without complications. Plague outbreaks were halted. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, each fell to this invisible ally. The process was elegant in its simplicity. Identify the bacterial invader, match it with a phage that preyed on it, administer the phage, and wait. The virus would multiply inside the bacteria, destroy it, and vanish once its job was done. There were no side effects, no resistance, no lingering chemicals, just targeted precision. Western scientists took note. In the 1930s, major pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly began producing phage-based medicines. Journals published promising results. Hope flickered that this could become a foundation of modern medicine. Then penicillin arrived. Antibiotics didn't require identification of specific bacteria. They could be stored indefinitely. They could be mass-produced, standardized, and most importantly, patented. With penicillin, medicine entered the era of one-size-fits-all cures, and the economic model shifted. Bacteriophages, in their natural specificity and variability, couldn't be patented. They required skilled microbiologists to match phage to patient. There was no way to scale and sell them as commodities. By the 1950s, phage therapy in the West had all but disappeared. Medical schools dropped it from curricula. Funding dried up. Regulatory hurdles rose. And yet, in the Soviet Union, the treatment quietly thrived. Not because of ideology, but because their system didn't require medicine to be profitable. Phages continued to cure infections year after year, patient after patient. As antibiotic resistance grew in the late 20th century, some scientists returned to phages. They discovered what the Soviets had known all along. Phage therapy still worked, especially against bacteria that antibiotics could no longer touch. Clinical trials in Europe and the United States confirmed their effectiveness. But even today, accessing this treatment remains difficult. Regulatory systems designed for chemical drugs struggle to accommodate living therapies. Clinical trials are expensive, and pharmaceutical companies see little incentive to fund treatments that can't be patented or easily monetized. The irony is painful. In our search for answers to superbugs, we have overlooked a century-old solution, not because it failed, but because it didn't fit the model. Imagine a world where infections are met not with broad-spectrum assaults, but with precision-guided allies. Where healing is not about overwhelming the body with drugs, but restoring balance with nature's own tools. Where medicine adapts not to market forces, but to the needs of each patient. That world is possible. It always was. The story of phage therapy is not just about missed opportunity. It's about the tension between what we can do and what we choose to support. Between healing that is simple and healing that is profitable. It forces us to ask how many other cures have we ignored, not because they were ineffective, but because they were too effective to be controlled. The viruses that save us still exist, waiting in soil, in water, in forgotten labs. What's missing is not the science. It's the will to embrace a different kind of future, one where nature is not just a threat to be managed, but a partner in our healing. It began with a hammer and the sound it didn't make. In 1941, Henry Ford stood before a small crowd beside a prototype car unlike any the world had seen. He lifted a sledgehammer and brought it down hard on the trunk of the vehicle. The crowd braced for impact, but the panel didn't dent. The hammer bounced off harmlessly. This wasn't steel, it was plastic, made from hemp. For years, Ford had envisioned a future where automobiles were grown, not mined. His engineers had developed a bioplastic composed of hemp fibers and other agricultural materials bonded with a resin. The result was a material lighter than steel, 10 times stronger in impact resistance, and fully biodegradable. It didn't rust, it didn't corrode, it returned to the earth when no longer needed. Ford's idea was radical in its simplicity: cars that farmers could help build. Hemp could be grown quickly and renewably, enriching soil instead of depleting it. The fuel, too, could come from crops, a closed-loop system, clean, efficient, sustainable. Lab tests confirmed the advantages. The car panels were stronger than steel, yet drastically lighter, improving fuel efficiency. Manufacturing produced fewer emissions. The entire life cycle, from field to junkyard, was environmentally superior to metal or petroleum-based plastics. And yet, within a year, the dream dissolved. In 1937, the United States passed the Marijuana Tax Act. The law made no meaningful distinction between hemp, non-psychoactive cannabis used for industrial purposes, and marijuana. Growing hemp became legally cumbersome, economically unviable. The fields Ford had purchased for cultivation lay fallow. His research program was shuttered. The hemp car quietly disappeared. Meanwhile, a different industrial future took root. Petroleum-based plastics, derived from oil refinery byproducts, became the material of choice. Unlike hemp, they could be patented, standardized, and mass-produced. Oil companies sold the feedstock. Chemical companies manufactured the plastic. Automakers bought the materials. It was a seamless, profitable chain. Hemp plastic posed a different kind of problem. It worked too well. It disrupted the cycle of obsolescence. It threatened to shift economic power from centralized industry to distributed agriculture. A material that lasted decades and returned to the soil didn't require replacement. That, for an economy built on consumption, was unacceptable. Today, hemp plastic exists, but only in small markets, mostly in countries where hemp cultivation is once again legal. The properties remain the same: strong, light, clean. But without the industrial infrastructure to support it, it cannot compete at scale. It remains more expensive, not because it's inferior, but because it's inconvenient to the systems we built around other materials. Imagine if we had taken a different path. If cars had become biodegradable machines built from crops. If farmers became suppliers not just of food, but of mobility. If the line between agriculture and industry had blurred into something more sustainable. Instead, we chose plastics that clog oceans and steel that rusts away. We chose systems that require constant inputs of energy, of materials, of money. Systems that work, but always just enough to keep needing more. The hemp car reminds us that better materials aren't always embraced. Sometimes they're buried, not for lack of proof, but for lack of alignment with prevailing interests. And in that silence, between the echo of the hammer and the absence of change, lies a question. What kind of progress are we truly building, and what have we left behind on the road not taken? It grew quietly, like a tree, and maybe that was the problem. In villages across Africa and South Asia, health workers once carried small bags filled not with pills, but with seeds. Moringa oleifera, called the miracle tree, was simple to plant, fast to grow, and astonishing in its power. Its leaves held more nutrition per ounce than almost any food on Earth. 7 times the vitamin C of oranges, 4 times the calcium of milk, more vitamin A than carrots, more potassium than bananas, and a surprising amount of protein and iron. A handful of dried moringa leaves each day could prevent or reverse malnutrition, especially in children. In the 1970s and 80s, field trials began. Aid workers in Niger, Senegal, India, and the Philippines planted moringa around schools and clinics. They dried and powdered the leaves, stirred them into porridge, and waited. The results were immediate. Children gained weight. Their energy returned. Hair grew back. Skin brightened. In areas where vitamin deficiencies were common, health improved rapidly. All from a tree that could be grown in a backyard with almost no water, no pesticides, and no external support. And moringa was just getting started. Its seeds could purify water. Crushed and added to dirty containers, they caused impurities to clump and settle. Its oil was useful for cooking, cosmetics, even machinery. Its bark could be used for fuel, its leaves for livestock feed. Every part of the tree offered something. It was a solution that scaled not through complexity, but through simplicity. For a time, global health organizations embraced it. The World Health Organization supported programs. Universities published studies. Nonprofits distributed seeds. Communities became nutritionally self-sufficient. But success has a strange gravity. As word of moringa's power spread, something shifted. Supplement companies in the West saw a new product, dried moringa powder packaged as a superfood, sold at high prices in health stores. Patents were filed on extraction methods. The tree that once grew freely now had commercial handlers. And something else happened, more quietly. Funding for village-level programs declined. Aid agencies changed focus. Regulatory barriers appeared. In some regions, moringa seeds were banned as invasive. In others, certification requirements made local production prohibitively expensive. The miracle tree was slowly pushed from the field into the marketplace. Today, moringa is available in capsules, in smoothies, in upscale grocery stores, far from the communities where it once thrived. It is praised for its benefits, but mostly for individuals who can afford it. Meanwhile, in places still struggling with malnutrition, the large-scale programs that once championed moringa have faded away. Why? Because moringa worked too well. It didn't require continuous aid shipments. It didn't need fortified cereals or vitamin supplements. It bypassed supply chains, profit margins, and dependency models. It gave people the means to nourish themselves, with nothing more than soil, water, and sunlight. That kind of independence is quietly revolutionary and quietly inconvenient. The miracle of moringa was never just its nutrients. It was its implication that solutions to major global problems might already exist, unpatented and underfoot, ignored not because they fail, but because they free. In the rustling of its leaves, there was a whisper. What if health didn't have to be bought? What if hunger could be answered not with shipments, but with seeds? And perhaps that whisper grew too loud for systems not built to listen. It begins not with a crack, but with the silence after it. In the early 2000s, a Dutch microbiologist named Henk Jonkers asked a simple question. What if concrete could heal itself? The idea seemed absurd at first. Concrete is the foundation of modern civilization. Roads, bridges, tunnels, buildings. But it's also deeply flawed. It cracks, it weathers, it decays. Every year, billions are spent on repairs, inspections, replacements. The system is expected to erode. Its fragility is built in. But Jonkers imagined something different. At Delft University of Technology, he created a concrete that wasn't just strong, but alive in a sense. Inside the mix, he embedded dormant bacteria, tiny, resilient organisms capable of surviving for decades. Alongside them, nutrients. The moment water seeped into a crack, the bacteria would awaken, consume the nutrients, and excrete limestone, sealing the gap. No epoxy, no repair crews, just life meeting damage and quietly undoing it. Lab tests were breathtaking. Cracks disappeared in weeks. The material regained its strength. Engineers watched as samples damaged on purpose slowly returned to their original form. In real-world applications, parking structures, building facades, self-healing concrete performed just as it had in the lab. Where traditional sections fractured and crumbled, the new material endured. The implications rippled outward. Longer-lasting buildings meant less cement production, cutting down one of the largest industrial sources of CO2. Fewer repairs meant fewer delays, fewer hazards, less waste. The economic logic was sound. Even if it cost more up front, the long-term savings were immense. A bridge that lasts 200 years instead of 30 doesn't just save money. It changes the scale of infrastructure entirely. At first, interest surged. Pilot projects launched. Jonkers received awards. Industry journals buzzed with promise. And then, resistance. Not because the concrete didn't work, but because it worked too well. Construction, after all, is not just about building. It's about rebuilding. An entire ecosystem thrives on planned obsolescence. Inspection firms, maintenance crews, concrete suppliers, contractors. A material that doesn't fail disrupts all of that. Cement manufacturers saw another problem. If a structure lasts 10 times longer, demand for cement plummets. Profits shrink. The cycle slows. Worse still, regulations didn't know what to make of it. Building codes hadn't caught up. Insurance providers balked at materials with century-long claims. Bidding systems favored the cheapest short-term cost, not lifetime value. The economics of durability had no place in a world built on replacement. So self-healing concrete remained a specialty product, used in a few eco-conscious buildings, featured in articles but not in city plans. The silence returned, not because the idea failed, but because it asked too much of a system unwilling to change. Imagine if the very walls around us could live longer than we do. If maintenance became an exception, not a routine. If cities age gracefully, not in fragments. That future exists. In formulas, in factories, in a few forgotten structures still quietly sealing their own wounds. But it hasn't become normal. Because sometimes durability is dangerous, not to us, but to industries built on deterioration. In a world where everything is designed to break, what does it mean to create something that lasts? The answer might lie not in concrete itself, but in the cracks we never have to see again. It started with dust, crushed rock, gray and dull. Nothing extraordinary to the eye. But in the late 19th century, a German chemist named Julius Hensel believed this dust held a secret. He called it bread from stones, and his experiments suggested that rock powder, spread over depleted farmland, could restore fertility more effectively than any chemical fertilizer. The idea was beautifully simple. Soil, over time, loses minerals essential to plant health. Industrial farming accelerates that loss. Chemical fertilizers replace only a few nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But plants need dozens more: magnesium, zinc, iron, copper, manganese. Without them, yields decline. Nutritional content suffers. Crops weaken. Hensel's answer? Return minerals to the soil using ground rock, basalt, granite, volcanic dust. Not synthetic, not manufactured. Just the Earth's own material, finely milled. And it worked. Fields treated with rock dust came back to life. Yields doubled, sometimes tripled. Pests faded. Plants grew stronger, more resilient to drought and disease. Most strikingly, food grown in remineralized soil contained far higher levels of vitamins and trace elements. Not just more food, but better food. Other researchers confirmed the results. Agricultural stations across Europe ran trials. Farmers marveled at the difference. The land itself seemed to breathe again. And yet, the practice was quietly pushed aside. By the mid-20th century, synthetic fertilizers had become a global industry. Backed by advertising, government subsidies, and institutional momentum, they offered a sleek, modern vision of farming. Bags of scientifically balanced pellets replaced wagon loads of dusty rock. Fertilizer companies flourished. Universities aligned their research. Farmers were taught that NPK was all they needed. There was no room for crushed stone. Because rock dust had a problem. It couldn't be patented. It couldn't be standardized. It was too cheap, too simple, too unprofitable. Chemical fertilizers, by contrast, created dependence. They had to be reapplied each season. They fed the plant, not the soil. Over time, they worsened the very depletion they were meant to fix, ensuring their own necessity. The rock dust solution faded into obscurity. Hensel died. His work was forgotten outside a few circles of soil scientists and organic farmers. Then, in the late 20th century, the idea returned. Farmers in Scotland, Australia, North America began spreading rock dust again. And once more, it worked. Crops flourished. Soil regenerated. Nutritional values rose. But the mainstream agricultural system, now thoroughly entwined with chemical inputs and agribusiness, barely blinked. To adopt remineralization widely would mean rethinking not just fertilizer, but the entire model of agriculture. It would mean giving farmers more autonomy, reducing sales of pesticides, additives, supplements. It would mean healing soil instead of managing symptoms. And that was too much. So the fields continue to weaken. Food continues to lose nutrients. And crushed stone, one of the most ancient and effective soil restorers, remains sidelined. What if the cure for soil exhaustion was never synthetic? What if health, of plants, of people, of ecosystems, was always rooted in the ground beneath our feet? Rock dust doesn't promise instant miracles. It asks for time, for patience, but in return it offers something profound: regeneration without dependency, growth without depletion, food that nourishes deeply. It's not a magic bullet. It's older than that. It's geology. It's memory. It's a whisper from the earth itself saying, "I can still feed you, if you remember how to listen." It began in the deep, warm waters of the Pacific, where the ocean hides a quiet, untapped power. In the 1970s, engineers at the Natural Energy Laboratory of Hawaii tapped into something ancient and immense: the difference in temperature between the sun-warmed surface and the cold depths below. That difference, often more than 20 degrees Celsius in tropical waters, was enough to run a heat engine, a method called ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC. The concept wasn't science fiction. It had been theorized for decades, but in Hawaii it became real. In 1979, the mini OTEC plant generated net power at sea, producing more energy than it consumed. It ran day and night, unaffected by sun, wind, or waves. In 1980, a larger version on the island of Nauru proved even more promising. OTEC didn't just work, it worked continuously. The benefits were staggering. Unlike solar or wind, OTEC offered baseload power, consistent and reliable. It was clean, producing no emissions or waste. The only byproduct was cold, nutrient-rich seawater, which actually boosted local marine life. OTEC plants could also desalinate water and support aquaculture, all while generating electricity. Studies showed that large-scale OTEC plants could power entire islands, even nations. Floating stations could be positioned across tropical oceans, delivering energy via undersea cables or converting it into hydrogen fuel. The oceans, covering over 70% of Earth's surface, could become vast power stations. By 1983, the technology was ready to scale. And then, the silence began. Funding from the U.S. Department of Energy was slashed. Research teams were disbanded. Pilot projects were abandoned. No technical failure had occurred. The experiments had succeeded. The concept was sound. But support vanished just as OTEC approached commercial viability. Official reasons cited budget constraints, shifting priorities. But deeper currents were at play. OTEC's very success threatened powerful systems. Fossil fuel industries recognized a long-term competitor. Electric utilities saw a model of distributed energy that could bypass centralized grids. Oil companies, already controlling much of global energy, had no stake in an ocean-powered future, and policymakers, under pressure from entrenched interests, quietly redirected resources elsewhere. Some research limped on. In Japan, India, a few academic labs. But without major backing, OTEC remained in the shadows, overshadowed by newer, flashier technologies. Meanwhile, billions flowed into solar and wind, intermittent sources requiring batteries, backup systems, and complex grids. OTEC, with its steady, clean output, might have reduced the need for such layers. But that simplicity made it dangerous to profits, to hierarchies, to assumptions. Imagine a world where energy doesn't need to be mined, burned, or rationed, where power flows from the ocean endlessly and without smoke, where remote islands are no longer dependent on diesel shipments, where energy is as quiet and constant as the tides. That world was almost built. But in a system driven by scarcity, abundance can be terrifying. OTEC still works. The ocean still waits. The heat gradient hasn't gone anywhere. What's missing is not technology, but will, vision, a readiness to let go of old dependencies and embrace a power source that asks only that we listen to what the Earth is already offering. A forgotten plant off the coast of Hawaii once proved this future was possible. Its turbines spun silently in the ocean air. Then the cables were unplugged, and the future receded with the tide. But the sea remembers. It started with a fever and ended with something close to a cure. In the 1890s, a New York surgeon named William Coley noticed something strange. Patients with infections sometimes saw their cancer tumors shrink. It was rare, unexpected, but unmistakable. The immune system, awakened by a bacterial invader, seemed to turn its attention to malignant cells as well. So Coley began experimenting. He developed a mixture of heat-killed bacteria, Streptococcus and Serratia, and injected it directly into tumors. The results were startling. Inoperable cancers receded, soft tissue sarcomas vanished, patients expected to die lived, some for decades. He called it immunotherapy. His peers called it dangerous, unscientific. But Coley persisted, carefully documenting hundreds of cases. By the early 20th century, his method was used in major hospitals. Memorial Hospital in New York, now Memorial Sloan Kettering, housed many of these treatments. His toxin blend triggered high fevers and intense immune responses. But when it worked like nothing else. Then the tide shifted. Radiation therapy emerged in the 1930s. Chemotherapy followed in the 1950s. These treatments could be standardized, scaled, and, critically, patented. Coley's method was none of these. It required clinical judgment, individualized dosing, careful monitoring. It didn't fit the growing model of assembly line medicine. By the 1960s, his daughter, Helen Coley Nautz, tried to preserve his legacy. She founded the Cancer Research Institute and compiled over 1,000 cases. The survival rates were astonishing. For some cancers, especially sarcomas, Coley's toxins had better outcomes than modern treatments. But the medical establishment had moved on. Hospitals preferred treatments they could control and bill uniformly. Pharmaceutical companies ignored the toxins. They were natural, unpatentable, unprofitable. Regulators demanded trials no one would fund. And so the approach faded. Medical schools stopped teaching it. New generations of oncologists never heard his name. Then, in the late 20th century, immunotherapy returned. This time with high-tech tools, monoclonal antibodies, checkpoint inhibitors, engineered T cells. The principles were the same: stimulate the immune system to fight cancer. But now, the drugs were proprietary. Expensive. Patent protected. And suddenly, the world listened. Coley, once dismissed, was retroactively credited as the father of immunotherapy. His insights had been correct. His results, real. But his method, the simple bacterial blend, remained in the shadows. Why? Because it worked too well and too simply. Because it cured without a product pipeline. Because it didn't fit the financial model that modern medicine had evolved to serve. Today, Coley's toxins are nearly impossible to access. They are not FDA approved. They remain outside mainstream oncology despite their history. Patients with no other options sometimes seek them out, traveling overseas or joining rare research programs. But for most, they are invisible. Imagine if, instead of being forgotten, his work had been expanded, refined, supported. How many lives might have been saved? How many decades of suffering shortened? The story of Coley's toxins isn't just a medical footnote, it's a mirror. It reflects how easily innovation can be eclipsed by systems that value scale over nuance, profit over possibility. He didn't discover a miracle. He discovered a mechanism, a way to help the body remember what it's capable of. The fever was never the cure. It was the signal. The body waking up, the immune system reclaiming its power. And perhaps the real illness is how often we forget to trust the body at all, especially when the cure can't be sold in a bottle. It was thinner than paper, so thin it was almost invisible. In 2012, scientists at MIT demonstrated something extraordinary. A membrane made of graphene oxide, just 1 atom thick, could filter water with astonishing precision. Salt, bacteria, viruses, heavy metals, gone. What remained was clean, pure water, produced with a fraction of the pressure and energy required by conventional systems. Graphene, a lattice of carbon atoms arranged like honeycomb, had already been hailed as a wonder material. It was strong, light, conductive. But this, water filtration, was different. It was elegant, immediate, and deeply human. In a world where over 2 billion people lack access to safe drinking water, the implications were immense. Conventional desalination, like reverse osmosis, is energy-intensive. Thick polymer membranes must be forced to separate salt from water, consuming electricity and straining infrastructure. But graphene let water glide through like silk while blocking almost every contaminant. The process was faster, cheaper, cleaner. Lab tests confirmed it. Contaminated water sources, brackish wells, seawater, even industrial runoff, were transformed into safe drinking water. The membranes needed less maintenance. They lasted longer. They were scalable. And for a moment, the future felt clear. Pilot projects were funded. Philanthropic organizations showed interest. Headlines spoke of a water revolution. A membrane so efficient it could fit in a household device, run off a small solar panel, and purify water anywhere. Then the momentum slowed, not because the science failed, but because the implications became too wide and too disruptive. Water scarcity in many regions is not just a crisis, it's a business. Utilities profit from rising prices. Governments leverage water as a political tool. Industrial water systems require vast infrastructure, long-term contracts, expensive upkeep. The promise of decentralized, ultra-cheap purification posed a threat to all of that. If people could filter any water source independently, no central grid, no monthly bills, no need to truck in bottles, what happens to the companies built on scarcity? More subtly, pollution itself became less urgent in the eyes of some industries. If filtration becomes easy and cheap, why prevent contamination in the first place? Regulatory pressure softens when cleanup seems effortless. And then there was the problem of scale. Producing graphene membranes without microscopic defects remains a technical challenge, but not an impossible one. With proper investment, industries solve harder problems all the time. Yet the funding needed to commercialize graphene filters never fully arrived. Companies shifted focus to other graphene applications, batteries, sensors, coatings. Water faded to the background. Meanwhile, the crisis persisted. Droughts worsened. Water tables dropped. Millions continued drinking from unsafe sources. And a nearly perfect solution sat in laboratories, underfunded, and underused. Imagine a world where clean water is a right, not a commodity, where deserts bloom, where refugee camps have endless safe water, where every village, every home can purify what flows around them. Graphene didn't just offer a filter, it offered freedom. And that may be why it was sidelined. The future doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it arrives silently, sliding through a microscopic hole in a sheet of carbon, and then waits for courage, for vision, for a system willing to welcome abundance without needing to control it. The water is still there. So is the filter. The question is, what are we waiting for? It hummed quietly in a concrete lab at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a machine that defied nuclear expectations. In the 1960s, as the Cold War escalated and nuclear power raced forward, a small team of scientists built a different kind of reactor. It wasn't fueled by uranium rods or cooled with high-pressure water. It didn't require massive containment domes. It couldn't melt down. And it didn't make weapons. This was the Molten Salt Reactor Experiment, MSRE, and it ran on thorium. Thorium is a silvery metal more abundant than uranium, found all over the world. When dissolved in molten salt and heated, it can sustain a nuclear reaction safely and efficiently. The reactor at Oak Ridge used this principle, and it worked. From 1965 to 1969, the MSRE ran without serious incident. It operated at atmospheric pressure, eliminating the risk of explosions. If anything went wrong, the liquid fuel could be drained into tanks where the reaction stopped automatically. The waste produced decayed in centuries instead of millennia. There was no need for enrichment, no plutonium byproducts. Engineers celebrated. The reactor was stable, efficient, elegant. It could run on fuel extracted from the earth without complex refinement. It could burn over 99% of its fuel, compared to just 1 to 3% in conventional reactors. It didn't threaten the environment. It didn't feed the arms race. And that, perhaps, was the problem, because thorium reactors couldn't produce weapons-grade material. The entire nuclear industry, especially during the Cold War, had grown around dual-use technology. Civilian reactors powered cities, but also generated plutonium for bombs. That dual purpose justified massive funding, infrastructure, and secrecy. Thorium offered only energy. Worse still, switching would mean abandoning billions in sunk costs. The uranium fuel cycle was entrenched: mines, enrichment plants, storage facilities. Corporations and governments had invested decades into that path. Starting over, even with a superior system, meant disrupting an entire ecosystem of contracts, patents, and political interests. So, in 1973, the thorium program was quietly defunded. The MSRE was shut down. Its success shelved, its documentation archived. Engineers who had built a safer, cleaner future watched as it was replaced by more familiar and more dangerous designs. Decades passed. Nuclear power continued, plagued by accidents, long-lived waste, and public fear. Thorium remained a footnote, spoken of in academic papers and small conferences. But in recent years, the idea has returned, especially in countries like China and India, which have large thorium reserves and fewer ties to legacy uranium infrastructure. New designs are being tested. Interest is rising. The MSRE is being re-examined, not as a relic, but as a roadmap. What if we had followed it in the first place? Imagine a nuclear industry built around safety instead of secrecy, around clean energy, not covert armament, around abundant fuel, not geopolitical choke points. Imagine a planet powered by a metal no one needs to fight over. The thorium reactor wasn't a failure. It was a success that came too soon and too cleanly. And perhaps that's the question it still asks. Can we build energy systems for life, not leverage? For generations, not just quarters? In the silent core of the MSRE, molten salt once flowed like fire contained, safe, stable, and glowing with possibility. It still could. It moved through tunnels with a hush, faster than sound, gentler than wind. In the 1960s and 70s, engineers explored an idea that seemed torn from science fiction: transportation through pneumatic vacuum tubes. The concept was simple and old in its roots. Pneumatic systems had long been used to move mail and parcels through buildings. But what if they could move people at hundreds of miles per hour? Prototype systems were built. One, developed by Lockheed, launched human-sized capsules through test tunnels at speeds over 260 meters. The ride was smooth, quiet, and energy efficient. Unlike rail or air travel, it didn't require fossil fuels or massive infrastructure. Acceleration was gentle, pressure controlled, and the tunnels were shielded from weather and traffic. Optimized designs suggested even greater possibilities. Speeds over 500 mph, urban networks that moved people from suburbs to city centers in minutes. Long-distance travel that rivaled jetliners in speed, but used a fraction of the energy. The potential was staggering. Underground tubes could eliminate surface congestion. Commuting times would vanish. Noise pollution would drop. Accidents would become rare, and because the systems used electric motors in low-pressure environments, they were astonishingly efficient. Braking energy could be recaptured. Power demands were minimal, environmental impact nearly zero. The Department of Transportation funded studies. Cities considered pilot routes. Technology companies built components. Cost-benefit analyses looked promising. Everything pointed toward a new era of high-speed, low-cost, sustainable transit. Then, in 1975, federal funding was cut. Research programs were terminated. Test tracks dismantled. The technology, just as it was preparing for public deployment, was shelved. Why? Because pneumatic transport threatened too many established industries. Automobile manufacturers saw a future with fewer cars. Oil companies foresaw reduced fuel demand. Airlines faced a competitor for short and medium-haul flights. Construction companies reliant on road and airport contracts saw their pipelines narrowing. Transit labor unions, wary of automation, raised concerns. Real estate interests feared the equalization of access. If every place is 15 minutes away, what happens to property values tied to location? Each of these forces, individually, had reason to resist. Collectively, they ensured that the project never left the lab. The dream didn't die. It was buried. Decades later, Elon Musk's Hyperloop revived public imagination. But even that has stalled amid technical hurdles, cost concerns, and similar institutional resistance. The truth remains. The physics were solved in the 1970s. The barriers now are political, economic, psychological. Imagine if, instead of gridlock and emissions, our cities flowed silently beneath our feet. If people could live anywhere and arrive anywhere, quickly, safely, affordably. If transport became a utility, not a burden, pneumatic systems offered more than speed. They offered a rethinking of mobility itself, a flattening of geography, a liberation from the noise and limits of roads. And perhaps that was the real danger. Some technologies fail because they're ahead of their time. Others fail because their time has no room for them. The pneumatic tube system didn't promise a better version of what we had. It promised something else entirely. And sometimes the future isn't blocked by failure, but by the fear of what it might change. The tunnels are gone. The capsules mothballed, but the idea still hums quietly like a train waiting just beyond the curve of history, ready to move if we dare to open the gate again. It was never about a single breakthrough, but about a pattern. One by one, the stories stack up. A virus that cured infections, but couldn't be patented. A plant that nourished the malnourished too well. A concrete that healed itself, undermining an entire repair economy. A metal that powered reactors safely, without fueling war. Each of these experiments succeeded. Not partially, not hypothetically. They worked. They did exactly what they were designed to do, and that, paradoxically, became their undoing. We tell ourselves that innovation is a meritocracy, that the best ideas rise, that solutions are rewarded, that progress is inevitable. But the history of these technologies suggests something else. That success is not just measured by results, but by how well those results fit into existing systems. And when a breakthrough threatens those systems, economic, political, industrial, it is not always welcomed. Often it is resisted. Softly, subtly, structurally. Funding is pulled. Regulations appear. Narratives shift. What was once promising becomes unproven. What once inspired awe becomes unrealistic. The memory fades. This isn't always a conspiracy. It's not a room full of men deciding what the future will be. It's inertia. It's the gravity of investment. It's the quiet weight of institutions built around managing problems, not erasing them. A cancer treatment that relies on the immune system and personalized care is incompatible with a model based on standardized protocols and patentable drugs. A water filter that purifies any source cheaply and easily undermines utilities, desalination plants, and bottled water industries. A transport system that's fast, clean, and nearly maintenance-free threatens roads, cars, fuel, labor models, and real estate prices. We've built economies on the idea that scarcity is natural, that wear and tear are inevitable, that problems must be managed indefinitely. But what if they're not? What if some can be solved completely? These stories raise uncomfortable questions. How much progress have we abandoned, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too thoroughly? What other answers are gathering dust in archives and laboratories, waiting for us to rethink the systems that rejected them? And perhaps most haunting, do we truly want solutions, or do we just want slightly better versions of the same problems? The technologies in these chapters are not dead. They still work. In some places, they're still used. In others, they wait for interest, for investment, for courage. The soil can still be healed with rock. Water can still be purified through carbon lattices. Concrete can still seal its wounds. Power can still rise from the deep ocean. Healing can still come from bacteria and trees and salt and light. These aren't miracles. They're memories of futures we almost had. To reclaim them, we don't need new inventions. We need new values. The final question isn't what we can build. It's what we're willing to let go of, to make room for what works too well. And in that space, perhaps, progress will finally feel like healing. It ended where it began, with power. But this time, not the electrical kind. Each of these experiments, every plant, every machine, every rediscovered material, offered a form of power that was quiet, regenerative, and deeply human. A power that didn't dominate, but enabled, that didn't require constant inputs, but gave more than it took. And perhaps that's what made them dangerous. When power shifts, from centralized to local, from controlled to shared, systems resist. Not out of malice, but out of design. After all, a factory thrives on planned obsolescence. A pharmaceutical empire grows by treating symptoms, not roots. A utility company profits when scarcity is maintained, and a political structure built around managing crisis can falter when the crisis quietly disappears. The deeper thread running through these stories is about independence, personal, communal, ecological. What happens when a village no longer needs shipments of fortified food? When a homeowner purifies their own water? When a bridge repairs itself for generations? When energy flows not from wires but from sunlight, seawater, and silence? We know the answer. It's not hypothetical. We've seen the experiments. They worked. Which brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Maybe the biggest threat isn't failure, it's success. Not just in science. In life, we live in a world increasingly shaped by artificial scarcity. Food exists in abundance, yet hunger persists. Clean water is technologically trivial, yet people die for lack of it. Energy can be drawn from wind, sun, earth, but fossil fuels remain dominant. We have the means to solve so many problems, yet often we don't. Because the systems designed to deliver solutions are entangled with the problems themselves. To imagine a different path is to imagine a different arrangement of power. One where healing is prioritized over profit, where durability matters more than disposability, where access is a right, not a business model, where knowledge isn't buried under patents but shared like sunlight. That's not utopia. It's responsibility. We've inherited a toolkit full of answers, buried under dust, locked in archives, dismissed in boardrooms, neglected in textbooks. Some need refinement, others need investment, but most of all, they need permission. Permission to work, not for shareholders, for all of us. The future isn't waiting to be invented. In many ways, it's waiting to be remembered. These were not failures. They were successes that demanded too much change, too soon, in the wrong context. And now, in a time of ecological collapse, social unrest, and technological acceleration, perhaps the context has changed. Maybe now is the time to revisit what once seemed too good to be true, because it wasn't a dream, it was a choice, and it still is. The threads return here, at the end, not to a conclusion, but to an opening. Each story we've told is a window. Together, they form a mirror, not just of what we've lost, but of what we continue to overlook. The question is not whether these technologies worked, they did. The question is why success in these cases wasn't enough. Why did the world reject the concrete that could heal itself, the water filters that needed no infrastructure, the soil amendment made from stone dust? Why was the cancer cure buried in favor of more profitable treatments? Why did we walk away from a car that wouldn't rust, an energy source as constant as the sea? It wasn't science that said no. It was us. Or rather, the systems we've built. Systems that reward maintenance over resolution, complexity over simplicity, short-term gain over long-term stewardship. Systems that fear abundance because scarcity can be monetized. But here's the deeper truth. These systems are not fixed. They're made of choices. And choices can be changed. The man who held a hammer to a hemp car in 1941 was choosing a future. The researchers who filtered seawater with graphene chose to believe water should be free. The farmers who spread rock dust on their fields chose to restore rather than deplete. None of them were prophets. They were people who saw clearly, just for a moment, what was possible. So what do we do with that clarity? We begin again, not by chasing silver bullets, but by revisiting forgotten tools. Not by waiting for breakthrough inventions, but by recognizing that many of the answers already exist. In archives, in seeds, in soil, in open-source blueprints, in the wisdom of older systems, indigenous knowledge, and low-tech brilliance. This doesn't mean abandoning complexity, but balancing it with humility. It means asking not only can we do this, but who benefits if we do, and what do we lose if we don't. Some of these technologies will return. Some already are. Phage therapy is saving lives again, quietly. Moringa grows in community gardens. Thorium reactors are being reconsidered. None of it is gone. It's just waiting. For courage, for vision, for permission. So the final question is not what was lost. It's what we're willing to remember. And what we're ready to build now if we stop asking only what's profitable and start asking what's possible. Because progress isn't a line. It's a choice, made again and again, and now it's ours to make.